Hi class. Thanks for joining me again for our third video in our Unit 1 discussion of the early American history period prior to the American Revolution. Now, as we move through this and you look at your study guide, you're going to find that I have addressed, at least in some way, many of the things in the study guide. Doesn't mean I've hit all of them. I've tried, but it doesn't mean that I've hit all of them. But the same thing goes with this chapter. This chapter might be a little bit longer, at least in text. Or at least this part is going to be a little longer, at least in text. But I'm still going to try to keep this under about 30 minutes or thereabout. All right, so what have we got? We've established the majority of the colonies. We've seen the rise and fall of Massachusetts. Massachusetts, at least for a while, was part of the Dominion of New England after what we call the Glorious Revolution, which I don't know that we've talked about that just yet. Massachusetts will be sort of given its status back and its charter returned. And that's pretty important because Massachusetts is probably, if you want to think on the sheer volume of trade, one of the most important areas of the colonies, along with New York. Eventually, New York is going to get to that point, and Philadelphia. Philadelphia has more people living in it than any other single city in the British colonial holdings, at least in North America. Now, the British colonial system is going to rely very much on local governments. There's the House of Burgesses in Virginia. There's the General Council. Let's see, I think it's called the General Council in Connecticut. I don't remember what it's called in New England, but the various different colonies have different ways of dealing with issues. And in large way, this is shaping the independence movement. Because if you think about it, Britain is really not micromanaging what its colonies are doing. It's allowing them to pretty much shape their own affairs as long as they're not crossways with the crown, as long as the taxes get paid, and so on and so forth, then there really is not an issue. So there's this principle called salutary neglect. The British are neglecting its colonies in the fact that it's letting them pretty much do what they need to do, doing what they want to do, governing themselves as they wish. And the little rebellions that we see, such as during the Glorious Revolution of 1689, are really pretty rare, pretty few and far between. But there have been some times when the Crown or Parliament have stepped in, and we've seen some of those as well. But it's not until about 1650 that we start to see a large part of intervention in how the colonies in the New World are going to be managing their affairs economically, financially. Because many of these colonies are trading with whoever will offer them the best price, be it Spain or France or the Dutch or whoever the case may be. But in discussing mercantilism is this system where the mother country basically provides the protection, the colonies provide the raw materials, the mother country takes that raw materials and makes something out of it. Well, anytime you go and you buy a piece of furniture, it costs you more for the furniture than the wood it costs to build the furniture. I mean, that's just the way it's going to be by several times, more so than just simply the price of labor. And so in order to try to capture this money, in order to try to get the benefit of this system, the British are going to establish what is called the Board of Trade. And it's an attempt to crack down upon smuggling. And smuggling is going to be pretty important. The Board of Trade is going to institute the Navigation Acts, again around 1650, because of just how much the Dutch are buying out of the 13 American colonies, especially tobacco and other raw materials. And so what exactly does these Navigation Acts do? Well, first of all, the crews on the ships that sail in and out of the colonies must be predominantly English. Well, that's going to cut out Dutch ships or French ships. There's limits on how much exports can be taken out of the colonies unless it's taken first to England. So again, that's cutting down on foreign ships sailing into harbors and buying up American raw materials. And of course, the purpose of these acts are simply to make more money, to bring more money into the British Empire to fund England and the Crown. Okay, now there's benefits and hindrances when we talk about who benefits from this. Well, of course, England is going to benefit tremendously from mercantilism. And if you're in the colonies and you miss out on a really good sale, say $5 for a bushel of tobacco and you can only get $3 for it out of England, yeah, you're going to be upset and you're going to gripe. But one benefit to the colonies is you always know there's someone to buy your product. The product is not going to sit in warehouses and then finally just rot because nobody wants to buy it. So there's a benefit and there's a hindrance. But as we start moving toward the revolution, and we're getting close to that, as we start moving toward the revolution, we are going to start seeing more and more Americans willing to take the risk for a higher return. And so smuggling is going to be very common. There's no way the English can patrol every little harbor and slough up and down the Atlantic coast. And so smuggling really becomes the first great American industry. Now, starting around about 100 years pass, the colonies are still sort of they're developing, they're growing, they're doing what they need to do. But around 1650, we're going to start to see an event strike out down the entire length of the eastern seaboard, the 13 colonies, that we're going to call the Great Awakening. It is a religious movement. The Great Awakening, in some ways, is going to shape the American character because we're going to start hearing people refer to themselves as Americans, not necessarily only as Virginians or as Massachusetts men or as Carolinians, but as Americans. And part of it could be because of Reverend George Whitefield. And if you see it written, it looks like Whitefield. But George Whitefield was an itinerant preacher, and he came to the colonies from England, and he's not so much starting churches, but wherever he goes, people flock to hear his preaching, flock to hear his prayers. And he's going to be the face early on of the Great Awakening. Then you have a fellow by the name of Theodore Frelinghuysen, another guy named Tennant, and they're all going to be preachers that are going to be preaching the same message, rather you are in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, or Georgia, for example. Now, we're going to start to see the splitting of certain denominations. The fastest growing denominations in America at the time will be the Baptist and the Methodist. But we're going to start to see some splits there between the old lights and the new lights. The old lights, they want to keep doing things how they have always been done. The new lights are going to start looking at God more as a God of love and start kind of having a just slightly different view upon religion and the way the Bible discusses its principles, its theology. Now, in New England, you're going to have a preacher by the name of Jonathan Edwards. And Edwards is going to be just as important to the Great Awakening, but on a more regional scale. Edwards' grandfather had been the preacher of a church in Massachusetts. I think it was actually in Boston for many, many years. And Jonathan Edwards is going to sort of inherit the church, and he's going to continue on. And we're going to see spiritual revival in his church. His sermon style was very much hellfire and brimstone, very much in your face. As a matter of fact, one of his famous speeches, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, or sermons, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, I remember reading in high school as a part of English class, literature class. I don't know if any of you guys have or not, or maybe your 1301 course or 1302 course maybe looks into it. But it's a very in-your-face type of sermon. In fact, one of his parishioners, it is said, actually went and was so disturbed by that sermon that he killed himself when the sermon was over. And actually, this is near the end of the Great Awakening, and Edwards loses his church because of it. So here you have this sort of sharing of ideas, religious ideas that are connecting both one end to the other of the colonies. And again, we're going to start to see people more unified, and we're going to have that when the revolution breaks out. There's another movement that we need to discuss as well called the Enlightenment. And this is a scientific movement, and Benjamin Franklin is right in the middle of it. This is a movement of thought, of psychology. Of philosophy, that's the word. And this starts in England. And we have a lot of philosophers that are talking about the nature of government, the nature of human beings, the nature of man. What role does man play in the world? And we see the rise of a religious, well, it's actually, I don't know if you want to call it a religion or not. I guess you could, called deism, and the view that the world and natural law was a great machine, and that great machine was sort of built by a creator, wound up and let go, and that God really doesn't intervene in the lives of mankind. Now, a number of our founding fathers subscribed to this, at least in some way. Others maybe agreed with some of those tenets, but may not necessarily others. It's long said that Thomas Jefferson was a deist. I'm not really sure that that's 100% correct, but he does agree with some of the tenets. But the Enlightenment is going to focus very much on reason and natural law and the laws of nature. And in fact, we're going to see that even in the Declaration of Independence, when the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the rights of mankind, may be something that you are familiar with. And in fact, much of the thought on Thomas Jefferson and others of our founding generation came from the philosopher John Locke. John Locke is going to discuss that every person that is a citizen of a nation is a part of a social contract. I agree to pay my taxes. I agree to pay my taxes. I agree to obey the laws. But the government also has a role to play. That is, to provide a good place to do business, to provide safety, to provide care, and those things that I cannot do on my own. And if either side violates that social contract, well, then if I don't pay my taxes, may go to jail. If the government doesn't uphold its end, then the result could be revolution. And of course, that's eventually what we see in 1776. Now, as far as the Enlightenment concerned, there's not a lot of there's not a lot of American minds that are going to contribute much to it. We are shaped by it, but we are not driving figures within it. But Benjamin Franklin will be. Benjamin Franklin, of course, invents the bifocals, invents the Franklin stove, famously flew the kite with a key to discovered electricity was enlightening. And so we have that's Benjamin Franklin. We're going to see a number of wars break out. And in fact, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can get a brief view of those if you watch I think it's chapter 3, maybe chapter 2. I don't remember. But it's one of those many lectures that I have posted in YouTube and linked in Canvas. Okay. Now, the thing is, the larger the colonies get, the more people that are there, the more that we need to deal with natives on the horizon, we're going to see the cost arise on managing these colonies. And this is going to eventually lead us to a rift between the mother country, England, and the people of the colonies. So in 1756, I believe it is, 1756, 1754, we're going to see the beginning of something called the Great War for Empire, or the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Every name is correct for this particular conflict. It begins in 1754 and actually ends in 1763, so it's actually about 9 years long, but 7 Years' War is one particular name for it. And what we're going to see is England trying to force France and Spain both out of North America for the most part. Spain is in control of Florida. By the end of this, the Treaty of Paris that ends it in 1763, the British are going to control Florida as a colony. And so when the revolution breaks out, there's actually 15 or 16 colonies. Only 13 decide to split off from the mother country. France is in New France, or later on would be Canada. There's a huge chunk of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi had been explored by the French, and so therefore it is a block to further expansion to the west. And so many of the colonists want that land. They want to move into Kentucky. They want to move into what would be Tennessee, and so they're going to support this war. But when the war is over, the French are kicked out, the Spanish are kicked out of Florida, the British are going to find itself with a very, very large bill on how do we manage this incredible amount of space. So the British realize that their coffers are empty. The people in England are pretty much taxed as far as they can be taxed, but the taxes really in the colonies are pretty low. To be honest with you, the taxes that are charged to the colonists were minuscule compared to what was being charged in England. And so the idea comes, let's raise taxes on the colonies. Now, taxes are nothing that the colonists are unfamiliar with. They are. But the taxes usually went through the state legislatures. These are not going to go through the colonial legislatures. They're going to come straight from Parliament, straight from the Crown. And this is going to cause that rift to grow even more. It's going to financially begin to hurt the colonists. And so when we think about the idea of no taxation without representation, they will not be griping so much about taxation. They will be griping about the lack of representation. We want to be asked. We want to have a say in the matter. So that's going to be a big issue. Also, to make matters worse, in 1763, there are those that want to start crossing the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky, into Tennessee, but because of Native American issues out that direction, because of just the cost of maintaining a forest to protect these settlers as they cross the mountains, the British are basically going to say no. And they pass what is called the Line of Proclamation in 1763, which basically says you cross that line and establish a settlement across the Blue Ridge, you will be burned out and sent back, and everything you've worked for will be gone. And this is going to infuriate many of those colonists who feel like they have fought this war against the French, the Spanish, the English, the French and Indian War. They're going to be very, very upset about it. And one of those that will be very upset is George Washington, a young lieutenant, maybe even a colonel by this point, that was serving in the Virginia militia, fought at Fort Duquesne, and actually got accused of assassinating a French official there, which he was cleared of it by the end. But this is where we start to see George Washington work his way into the conversation. So one of the first attempts to raise money is going to be the Sugar Act, and it will be a tax on exactly what it sounds like, sugar or anything that has sugar in it. And the colonial reaction is going to be very loud and very visceral. They don't like this tax. They don't like the tax at all. And it leads one particular colonist, was it James Otis possibly, that says, listen, we oppose taxation without representation. And this is going to be the cry that is going to continue throughout this period in American history. Now, the colonists are saying, listen, we want to have a say, but the British and Parliament says you do have a say. It's something called virtual representation, that all of us are represented by the members of the Parliament because Parliament is looking out for the good of the empire. That's not what they want. They want direct representation. They want someone that understands the colonies and that can speak up for the colonies, because life in Virginia is very different than life in, say, London. And so this is going to be the argument made. And eventually the Sugar Act isn't going to make as much as they thought it would, and it eventually gets thrown out. About a year later, a Stamp Act gets passed. Now, it is an excise or a direct tax, which means you pay the tax before anything ever gets sold. Today, the only thing I know of with an excise tax on it in the United States today is alcohol. There's an excise tax on, say, whiskey and rum and that sort of a thing. Now, the House of Burgesses in Virginia are going to be very strongly opposed to this, even to the point that the House of Burgesses will be disbanded and not called back into session by the governor of the colony, Denmore? Nope. Well, why am I forgetting it? But the governor of the colony. The Sons of Liberty in Boston are going to rise up against secret groups, secret meetings, and eventually the Sons of Liberty are going to be the ones that start throwing tea overboard as a part of the Boston Tea Party. So the question is, are these rioters or are they rebels? Well, it kind of depends upon where you stood in the situation. If you're loyal to the British, these people are out of control. If you think that something needs to be done because the British are sort of moving beyond what they ought to be doing, well, then these are the rebels that are basically looking out for this independence that they believe we can have. And so the upper class are going to play a tremendous role in this, because with the Stamp Act, this is affecting lawyers and printers and merchants, because you got to write your bill of sales out. Well, you pay a tax on every sheet of paper under the Stamp Act. And the argument is going to be that their rights as Englishmen were being violated. Again, there are things that had been promised to them, and they feel like they are being violated. And as more and more of these meetings are going to be held, particularly in secret, we're going to start to see the quartering of soldiers, the housing of soldiers in the homes of prominent families, particularly prominent families who are viewed to possibly be talking about the crown and the Parliament, so secretly, and maybe planning something like boycotts against sugar or paper, for example. Now, the fact of the matter is, as we get closer to the Revolutionary War, and we are getting close to that, there are going to be a vast majority of those in England that do not like the idea of a revolution. They don't like the revolution. They don't like the idea of fighting to end one. They don't like the idea of holding on to the colonies that they don't want to be a part of the colonies. And one will be Edmund Burke, very famous speaker at the time. And there are a few others as well. But by the time we get to the 1768, 1770, our dependence upon England is pretty much broken, and there are those that have begun to question, do we need to remain a part of Great Britain? In this, about 1668, 1667, in what could be the first shots of the Revolution, some historians believe this to be the fact, I'm one of them that does, is at a place called Alamance in North Carolina. Alamance was a group called the Regulators rose up because of excessive spending and excessive taxes by the governor of North Carolina, Governor Tryon. And Tryon is going to march in there with his military and pretty much going to capture about 5 of the leaders. A bunch of the Regulators will be killed, and some of those leaders will be hanged and executed that way. If you've watched Starz series Outlander, of course it's kind of adult themed, sort of rated R in some places. But in this latest season, season 5, there was a depiction of the Battle of Alamance in North Carolina. It's a pretty good depiction, as best I can tell. I'm not a great student on that particular battle. But anyway, more and more are going to begin to call for boycotts against British goods, particularly British goods that are being taxed. And these taxes are such a failure. Eventually, the Parliament and King George III, are going to revoke those taxes. But they do put out an order, what they call the Declaratory Act, that Parliament could enact any law that it wishes. It basically says, we're going to get rid of these colonies, we're going to get rid of these taxes, but remember, you still have to obey us. So they're going to pass a new tax. This one is called the Townsend Duties, and it's going to tax molasses. It will tax paper. It will tax glass, lead, a little small tax on many, many things, including tea. Tea is another one. And of course, the British reaction is tough luck to these complaints that the Americans are going to have. Now, eventually, they are going to repeal that, but leave the tax on tea. So that's going to be an important thing to remember. In March of 1770 in Boston, things are sort of reaching ahead. As a matter of fact, several customs houses, that's where taxes are going to be paid, or taxes will be collected, are going to be burned, or going to be ransacked by some of these Sons of Liberty or other out-of-control rebels in the city of Boston. And so to guard one of the customs houses, a small group of very inexperienced soldiers are going to be dispatched. Redcoat soldiers are going to be dispatched to guard the customs house. And a group of working class, many of them sailors, dock workers, knot workers, rope makers, are going to gather up and begin to scream and shout at the soldiers. Some start to throw snowballs. Some of them actually have rocks in the snowballs. And so therefore these young soldiers, many of them 17, 18 years old, are feeling threatened. And one of them opens fire, and the rest of them do too. And you're going to see 5 dead out of the group, out of this mob that sort of rises up in the town common. And the soldiers will be arrested. They'll be put on trial. John Adams, future, he's going to be one of the ones that writes the Declaration of Independence, for example. He's going to actually defend them and get them off because he says, look, everyone deserves a fair trial. And this is where our idea of the Fifth Amendment and protection from undue persecution comes in our history, in American history. And so, again, John Adams is going to make a name for himself. It's not a good name necessarily among many of those that really oppose the British being there. But when John is going to lose much of his government contracts, they're going to start taking anyone that stands trial back to England for trial. He says, look, did I not do a good job? Well, yeah, but the way this is going on, we don't want to keep these trials here. And John's going to get very, very upset. And he's going to turn against the British and, again, will be a member of the Continental Congress. The Gaspee affair is going to be the seizing of, there's a ship that's going to be seized hauling smuggled goods. I don't remember all the detail of it, but it shows the escalating tensions of this whole affair. All right, so 1773, 3 years or so after the Boston Massacre, things are being focused on Boston again. The Townshend Acts pretty much have been gotten rid of because it's costing the British more to run these taxes, to collect the taxes, than they're making off of it. But they keep the tax on tea. Now, the tea tax had been repealed, but the tea portion of the Townshend Act had not been. And many of them in Boston are going to feel like this is, this is sort of the Crown playing funny with wording. And so in December 16th, 1773, a number of the Sons of Liberty, dressed as American Indians, painted bodies and all, row out to a ship anchored in the harbor, and they throw over something like $2 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. And they sail back. There's only a couple of sailors on board to guard it. Couldn't do anything about it with this huge group. But the British, this is East India Tea Company tea. And the East India Tea Company has a contract with the British government. They pay a huge amount of money to the British government, and the British government is not going to be happy about it. So they pass a new set of taxes called the Coercive Acts. In the American colonies, we call them the Intolerable Acts because it's intolerable. It's not fair. You shouldn't do this. And among other things, what it does is it's going to close down Boston Harbor. No ships go in, no ships go out until the tea has been paid for. And the other colonies like Virginia start to ask the question, if they can do this to Boston, do this to Massachusetts, they could do this to any of us. So that's what we have there. Now the legislatures of the colonies, again, are going to be weakened. Again, the British are asserting more and more control. The period of salutary neglect ended a long time ago. But there's going to be the call out for representatives of the states, of the colonies, can't call them states yet, of the colonies to meet in Philadelphia in September of 1774. This will be the First Continental Congress. And it's going to be a discussion. What do we do to try to get right with the king, to get right with the crown? Well, how do we make the argument for them to get rid of these taxes or at least give us representation? And so for the next about 2 years, we're going to see this back and forth, letters being written. The crown is going to get more and more determined to not listen to the colonists, and more in the colonies are going to be preparing for a revolution. So this is, for the most part, I actually got done a little faster than I thought I would. This is a real quick rundown of the road to revolution. I didn't cover every tax. I didn't cover every event. The next thing that probably you should see here is going to be maybe we're getting real close to the Declaration of Independence. That's going to be a conversation we'll probably have in the next video, and I will try to launch maybe in this playlist a reading of the Declaration of Independence. I believe it's important for every history student to be familiar with the Declaration of Independence, especially American history students. All right, that's all I have for today. I'll join me for the next one as we continue on with Unit 1. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.